One of the reasons why I wanted to focus the study in a social studies classroom was because a lot of the students do tend to be exposed to very controversial ideas in social studies, and we as educators have a responsibility to be able to talk about these things or these issues in a more academic environment. For ELL students, the reason why I wanted to focus much of this study in linguistic and racial identities was because I feel like there's this growing shift in our political environment and our social environment as a whole, especially pertaining to language and race. The reason why I think this was so important, and why even after doing all this research, it became an even more prominent idea, was because I do believe that we need to prepare our students to have these conversations, but also to start thinking about their placement in American society as it pertains to their language and their language, culture, and race. It is inevitable that once they grow up, that especially in this modern American society, that they will be exposed to racially charged issues, and they should be very well versed on how to handle those issues. Now, for English language learners, their racial identity has a lot to do with how they view racial issues as a whole in America. The reason why I say that is mostly due to their identity crisis, where that a lot of English language learners go through, especially in their formative years of youth. They do tend to have a more conceptualized notion of what race means to them and how that applies to their integration into American society. Now, a lot of the research that I did towards the end was more geared towards initializing this conversation, especially with ELL students, about teaching whiteness and white privilege. Being that the study is focusing on culturally responsive teaching, I felt that it is not only important to have culturally responsive teaching in order to incorporate ELL students' culture and language into the curriculum, but also the growing need to allow ELL students to understand what it means to be white and what it means when we talk about white privilege. And I think it became a more increasingly important point that I wanted to teach to ELL students, mostly because after looking at where we are at in terms of racial relations in America, I think it was one of the most important points in building this linguistic and racial identity in ELL students, because in the talks of race, it inevitably has to include their interactions and how that plays out within American society, and that often means how that will play out in interactions with white students. And I think that was one of the most important aspects of what I got from the study. And it does raise a lot of questions, like I mentioned in the slide, about how culturally responsive teaching will affect long-term ideologies or long-term identities of racial and linguistic backgrounds for ELL students, but also how will it affect the interactions outside of the classroom when we start talking about racial identities and linguistic identities with ELLs, but also how does that influence their interactions with their white peers. And that is something that in building ELL linguistic and racial identities, that is a hugely important part of what we should be teaching ELL students, because they're going to come across these issues of integrating into American society But if they don't have a clear understanding of what what their non-ethnic peers go through every day, and what their mentality is in terms of the historical context of whiteness and white privilege, then it really doesn't serve a purpose to be culturally responsive in the classroom if we are going to negate or even exclude that part of racial relations in America, because ELL students will always kind of come across these issues, and even as a general population or a general society here in America, those do tend to be one of the most controversial and talked about issues, especially because we are now gathering information on how past histories of racial policies and racial inequalities have contributed to this gap between English language learners and students of color in accordance to their white peers. And that's the importance that I felt that I got from doing most of this research.